I want to start off with a few disclaimers. First, this video contains spoilers for the entirety of The Last of Us Part 2 and major spoilers for Spec Ops: The Line, so if you have any interest in playing either of these games, I suggest you hold off on watching this until you do so. Also, please be aware that this video will contain footage and audio of extremely graphic violence as it is necessary to illustrate much of what I talk about. Secondly, this is not a comprehensive overview of The Last of Us Part 2. It's a focused examination of it, looking at various aspects of Part 2 through a certain lens to engage with it critically. If you want a multi-hour meandering review of someone dunking on the game, this is not it, but I can assure you there are plenty of those out there that are much easier to find than this. And finally, the purpose of this video is not to tear down the work of the hundreds of talented game developers that poured their souls into this game. I have great respect for video game developers who deserve far better than they get, as there is a staggering amount of toxicity around their occupation. This video is meant to treat the art they created seriously and to give it a fair, if critical, reading. Prior to launch, The Last of Us Part 2 was billed as a game about hate. Post-launch, in a podcast with narrative lead Hallie Gross and director Neil Druckmann, it was said to actually be a game about love, but what The Last of Us Part 2 is about, more than anything else, is excess. It's a game that spans about 25 to 30 hours to sell you on the idea that it is a grand revenge epic. It's a game that has your enemies scream in agony as you kill them, and I mean really scream. It's a game that painstakingly crafts a realistic picture of what the human body looks like when it's torn to shreds by bullets, explosives, fire, hammers, blades, teeth, and human hands. It's a game that has a multi-hour light open world section in the early hours of the game, seemingly just because it can. It's a game where the story is primarily characterized by an abject lack of any kind of subtlety and gets carried along by charismatic dialogue. It's a game that builds into a climax before cutting to black and revealing that there is another game's worth of content left that follows an entirely different character. At every possible turn, The Last of Us Part 2 is simply too much. Let's start with the story. When I say it isn't subtle, a good example comes from the ending. After all of the horrible things Ellie does in pursuit of Abby, the murderer of her surrogate father Joel, she leaves behind an idyllic life with her girlfriend to take up the hunt once again and tracks Abby down in Santa Barbara, only to find her half dead from her horrible treatment under a group of slavers. Ellie obviously tracked Abby down to kill her, but when she sees Abby in such a horrible state, and after having toured the slavers' facility as she fought to get to Abby, she sets Abby and Lev free with the intent to let them go. Ellie's choice here is communicated without any dialogue and is easily understandable. And yet, when the three of them make it down to the shore where there are two boats they can each leave from, Ellie has a PTSD flashback of Joel's mangled corpse, so she demands a fight with Abby, threatening to kill Lev if Abby won't comply. What then follows is a fairly gruesome fight that goes on for far too long as you watch two already half-dead women proceed to fight even further towards the brink of death. It ends with Abby biting off two of Ellie's fingers, but Ellie still gets the upper hand and almost drowns Abby before relenting as a memory of Joel playing guitar returns to her. The fight is already too much, but if Naughty Dog was really set on it, the fight would be better without the flashbacks of Joel. We already know Ellie's headspace, why she's here, and what she's after. Her need to fight Abby to the death could be communicated through body language, which is something Naughty Dog frequently does, because that's just the kind of thing free access to Sony's bank account lets you do. But instead, we get a Joel flashback to instigate the fight, and then a Joel flashback to stop the fight. These flashbacks actively take away from Ellie's agency and make the fight and the end of it feel much more driven by Joel than Ellie. It's also very unsubtly telling us why Ellie is doing these things rather than trusting the character work done so far to inform these decisions. And as for Ellie losing two of her fingers, it's unsubtle because of how prevalent her playing the guitar is throughout the game. Playing the guitar is framed as her last connection to Joel, so her being unable to play forces her to leave that behind and move on, whereas still having all of her fingers would make that come across as more of a conscious decision on her part. Not to mention that having her fingers bitten off is a ham-fisted way of saying that her vengeance quest has also cost her her last connection to Joel, and just so everyone is on the same page, the game has her play guitar so you can hear how out of tune it is and watch her give up on it. However, I guess you could still consider these things subtle for video games writing, but that's also kind of a weak defense at this point because there are so many better written games and it's easier to find them, now more than ever, especially if you're willing to look outside the AAA space. Naughty Dog goes after Hollywood-style writing hard, but the problem is that they don't commit to showing over telling the way the best movies do. Naughty Dog games are carried by just how good their voice actors are and by how well they can then bring those performances into their games. And, just to be clear, being the most subtle story ever does not a good story make. I've specifically focused on the lack of subtlety in the ending to illustrate how the excess of Part 2 manifests in the story, and how the writing, much like the characters in Part 2, just doesn't know when to stop. I don't consider Part 2 to be poorly written, but I don't find it to be particularly well written either, and I've been rather favorable to it thus far just by virtue of not talking about its more problematic elements, like how every black character once again dies, their arguably transphobic treatment of Lev, and the fact that despite having two women in the leading roles, their actions are both driven by their relationships to men. Much smarter and more qualified people than me have written pieces on those aspects, however, so I'll be linking some of them in the video's description. Lack of subtlety aside, according to Naughty Dog, Part 2 is really a game about love, so let's talk about that. Seeing the ending of the game my first time through made me consider the angle, and hearing that love is the stated intent made me try to see the game through that lens on my second playthrough. The thing is, Part 2 can only be a story about love if you have an extraordinarily warped view of love. Apparently, the vengeance quest that sees Ellie brutalizing everyone and everything in her path at every turn is actually about love, because this is what love drives you to. Hate, apparently, is just another facet of love. You can love someone so much that what happens to them will drive you to hate. This is what the story of Part 2 is driven by. Abby's love of her father festers into hatred for Joel, and Ellie's love of Joel festers into hatred for Abby. I say this is a warped way of looking at love because it is the most cynical possible way to think of love. In the real world, love doesn't just bring out the worst in us. More often than not, it brings out the best in us. But that's not the worldview Part 2 interprets reality through. Instead, it sees the world and people through the most excessively bleak lens possible, viewing everyone as animals regularly willing to level extraordinary cruelty against each other at the drop of a hat. There are loving moments in Part 2, almost exclusively in flashbacks, but there are not nearly enough of them to offset the fact that 80% of the game, at least, is about inhumanely slaughtering your way through however many people and infected you have to so that you can return murder with murder. No matter what Naughty Dog says about the intent of the story, the text of it is cruelty. Fleeting moments of kindness and tenderness cannot offset the core of the story, centering around some of the most graphic hyperviolence ever portrayed in the medium, and what's worse is that Part 2 absolutely revels in it. When push comes to shove, what the game really loves is the violence on display. During the early hours of the game, the only human we see die is Joel. Then Part 2 slows the pacing down considerably and pits you against infected for several hours. I think this is to make taking a human life carry more weight, which is immediately undone when Ellie is finally forced to kill another person, Jordan, one of Abby's friends who helped kill Joel. When Ellie kills him, the camera pans around so you can see his throat get slit and watch him gurgle on his own blood as the life flutters out of his eyes, an effect repeated with every single stealth kill. Even if you don't look at the faces of the people you murder from the shadows, every last one of them has the same gruesome attention to detail etched into their death as the first. If Part 2 was really, genuinely horrified of its own violence, it could communicate that in ways that aren't even remotely close to being this graphic. Spec Ops: The Line often comes up in conversations around violence in video games, so let's talk about the violence in it as a counterpoint to the violence in Part 2. Where Part 2 has enemies get shredded and mutilated and blown apart seemingly every chance it gets, the brutality in Spec Ops seems downright pedestrian. And yet, the entire game hinges on a single story moment where you use white phosphorus on civilians. For those unfamiliar with it, white phosphorus is a real weapon used by the US military that is essentially a war crime, but allowed through some loophole. In Spec Ops, you and your squad come upon overwhelming odds, so you use white phosphorus to wipe out all the enemy combatants, and afterwards you are forced to walk through the dozens and dozens of charred corpses. You see all of them left screaming and burning and smoldering, and then you come face to face with all the civilians you were, apparently, trying to save, only to find them huddled together with their flesh scorched off by your not quite a war crime. And the story in Spec Ops hinging on this moment absolutely does work because of how the brutality and violence is heightened in this single moment to make a point about the indefensible immorality of the US military-industrial complex and offer some biting rebuke at the player who likely signed up to play the game under the guise of playing another military shooter, the likes of which now glorify using white phosphorus as a fun multiplayer kill streak. But The Last of Us Part 2 applies its high-fidelity, unparalleled video game hyperviolence with the gentleness of a sledgehammer. There is no story moment where the violence is ever worse than what you regularly do to your enemies in-game, and the most brutal kill in the game, by far, is in a set-piece boss fight Part 2 wants you to think is just so cool. There's a man you kill as Abby who dies in what is undoubtedly one of the most brutal kills I've ever seen in a game. First, Abby slices his jaw open with a sickle. As the fight goes on, Abby's companion Lev shoots him in the shoulder with an arrow. When Abby finally kills him, she sticks her hand inside his sliced open jaw to pull on it, then she snaps the arrowhead off before stabbing it into his neck, his face, and then his neck again. During the whole process, the camera gets closer than usual so you can see every last gruesome detail. The plausible deniability here is that this kill is meant to be horrifying, meant to highlight the gruesome nature of violence. But frankly, I can't agree. The man Abby kills isn't some named NPC. He's a hulking goon who appears out of nowhere to beat the shit out of Lev, a child. The fight itself is as close as Part 2 gets to a boss fight against another person, and the consequences of this hyper-violent, stomach-churning kill is null. It's never remarked on. Abby doesn't care, neither does Lev. It is, for all intents and purposes, a set piece, and it's downright vile, not just because of the violence on display, but precisely because of the context in which it takes place. There is a story moment where the game could have been this graphic, the part where Ellie tortures Nora to death, but it instead focuses the camera on Ellie's face as Nora's gets smashed apart by a metal pipe. The most graphic violence in the game almost never comes from the story moments, but from the gameplay, where you are meant to feel powerful and good. There's a lot to break down with the gameplay, especially in regard to how the game wants you to feel about the violence, but I'm instead going to focus on a single HUD element: hit markers. Hit markers are a HUD element that anyone who has ever played a shooter, including Naughty Dog's very own last 3 games, has been trained to see as positive feedback. The little red hit marker to indicate when you successfully kill someone, the special hit marker they have when you land a headshot, it's all in service of adding positive feedback to the violence. You could argue that maybe this isn't the case in Part 2, but I would argue that hit markers exist outside of just Part 2, and in other Naughty Dog games with them, they are meant to provide satisfying feedback for the shooting experience. So regardless of intent, that is still what they do in Part 2, if only by virtue of how they are used in every single other game with them. Beyond just that context, however, it's also worth considering how much fine-tuning must have gone into their use in Part 2, and how that, in and of itself, adds positive feedback. Naughty Dog bills itself as a studio for perfectionists, so of course the hit markers in Part 2 are going to feel fine-tuned to make every single kill feel just right. The Last of Us Part 2 fundamentally can't be a game about love when the main language of interaction is fine-tuned hyperviolence. Outside of the sledgehammer subtlety of the story and the violence, however, Part 2 is also excessive in its length. Part 2 takes you through Ellie and Abby's journey block by block, keeping you with them almost every step of the way. The sheer refusal of the game to speed up any of the process results in remarkably long stretches of gameplay where virtually nothing story relevant happens. The only reason I can think of the game being so needlessly long, when it only serves to kill the already abysmal pacing of the story, is because structurally, for Part 2 to be an epic, it thinks it needs to be slow and long. Very little actually happens in Ellie's half of the story, but damn if it doesn't take longer than Abby's sections. There are entire hours of gameplay that could be cut without impacting the story at all. Sure, maybe the game would need to cut down on all the various notes throughout the world, but there are so many of those already that cutting out the unnecessary sections of the game would simply make Naughty Dog prioritize which notes are actually important and which aren't. A good example of Part 2 being needlessly long is the last 2 or so hours of Abby's Day 2, where first you need to go through a zombie-infected hotel, literally going down floor by floor, before reaching the hospital, where there's a Resident Evil-style massive zombie homunculus monster boss fight that is incredibly jarring and just how utterly out of place it is tonally and gameplay-wise, considering it's the only thing in the game that would be considered a traditionally gamey boss fight. It's also just unbelievably goofy and genuinely puts into perspective how completely juvenile the games industry is when this is the type of game we hold up as the pinnacle of our medium. The awful Schindler's List comparison that came about way back when, even when taken as it's intended, which is a comparison tonally, is laughable when the big zombie monster exists. If Schindler's List had a big Wolfenstein mecha at some point, then I guess the comparison would still hold up. But as is, well, I don't think so. But, more importantly, how do these sections feed into the story? The only important story event that happens in these entire 2 sections is about 10 minutes where Abby interacts with a WLF member outside the hospital before being taken prisoner and then released by Nora, and yet you will spend far more than 10 minutes on all of this. To be clear, a good story is more than just a series of events. If Abby and Lev had enough good character interactions throughout these sections, it would make them more meaningful, but they don't. They have a few in the hotel, but none in the hospital, because Lev doesn't tag along with Abby, which is why I consider segments like these unnecessary. Abby's campaign is generally much better paced than Ellie's, so she doesn't have as many sections that could be cut wholesale, or at least drastically cut down, but Ellie's is chock full of blocks and blocks of run-down buildings that feel completely unnecessary. The open world section with Ellie and her girlfriend Dina, the size of which makes it feel particularly unnecessary, at least offers some solid character interactions between the two of them, but at the same time, it becomes something of a bitter pill to swallow when you realize Dina gets completely sidelined after the end of the first day. The open world section has to exist because otherwise Dina and Ellie wouldn't get enough screen time for their relationship to fully develop. But the long bloated sections after that in Ellie's campaign don't have similar justifications. She has long stretches of uneventful gameplay just trying to get from point A to B in Seattle without anything important happening. For many of these, she has no one to play off of either, so it just comes across as pointlessly drawn out. I'm not trying to argue that letting the gameplay take center stage is a bad thing, but in a game where the story is its main draw, long story-light sections only end up hurting the game. The Last of Us Part 2 is an incredibly hard game to write about. I used to think that's because it's so complex, filled with parts to try and unpack and view in the context of a greater whole. After 2 playthroughs and about a month of mulling it over, however, I think Part 2 is a hard game to write about because it's kind of a mess. I decided to examine it through the lens of excess because it's the single strongest connecting tissue for the entire game. Everything in it is simply too much, from the story's inability or unwillingness to be subtle when it really needs to be, to the incredible levels of hyperviolence and the extreme length of the game. Excess is the through line. I didn't even touch on just how excessive Part 2 is as a technical powerhouse, but I don't think I need to. The game speaks for itself in that regard, with a dogged pursuit of photorealism that almost cuts it at times. I want to close all of this, however, by stating that I like The Last of Us Part 2. I think combat can be really fun, and while the long stretches of narratively empty gameplay actively harm the pacing of the story, I enjoy them. At the same time, after spending so much time on Part 2, thinking about it, playing it, and writing about it, my current thoughts really just land on it being a decent, fun video game, but certainly nowhere near as profound as it has been hailed to be. Like pretty much every modern Naughty Dog game, Part 2 is a messy game wrapped up in world-class production values. So, in other words, it's a Naughty Dog game, alright.